Welcome to Uncommon Sense, where we do our best to make it common again. I'm your host, Adrian Ahlquist. Today I'm joined with my dad, Dale Ahlquist. How are you?
I'm the better for your asking, Adrian. Thank you.
Whoa. Didn't expect that. No. So on January 10th, it was Chesterton's 100-year anniversary of visiting the United States, right?
Yeah, that's a true fact.
Yeah.
It's amazing. It's already been 100 years since he first arrived here.
I know, it's crazy. And so we're going to talk about that. We're going to talk about his visit, where he visited, and what he talked about. So right off the bat, what was the main purpose of visiting the United States for him?
It was a lecture tour. He was invited to speak in several different cities around the country, and all the lectures were arranged by an agent, a literary and lecture agent who, that's what he did. And that was the main purpose. But he met a lot of people. But he said like he was a racehorse being carried around in a train.
That's good he had an agent. That makes sense, because otherwise his wife would have probably had to take care of him.
Yes, and his wife had to take care of him anyway. So
yeah.
she obviously accompanied him.
Okay, good, yeah. Well, where did he visit?
Well, he arrived in New York City and went immediately then to Boston, where he gave his first series of lectures. But he went to many major cities: Philadelphia, Baltimore, went up to upstate New York, crossed over into Canada, spoke in Toronto and Montreal. He went through Detroit, Chicago.
Did he visit Minnesota?
Well, he did visit Minnesota, but he didn't give a lecture in Minneapolis.
Oh, wow.
I don't know if his agent just dropped the ball or wanted to give him. He was right here, but he stayed in the downtown Radisson. The ironic thing is, he met a major celebrity who happened to be staying in the same hotel, the heavyweight champion of the world, Jack Dempsey.
Okay. I don't know who that is, but that's cool.
There are a few people who are still alive who remember that he was considered one of the greatest boxers. Only undefeated champion of boxing.
Gotcha.
We'll talk about boxing for a while. but he went up to Duluth, and he gave a talk in Duluth, of all things. And then went to Omaha.
Cool.
Went as far south as Oklahoma, where he attended a famous murder trial.
Oh, wow.
And got into Tennessee as well before winding his way back to New York. 4 months in the United States.
Cool. Okay, so that's who we know he met, right? Did he meet anyone else that we know of?
Well, he met different literary and political celebrities, but I'm going to place a bet here that you probably don't recognize those names either. He met I think one person you should know, but no one knows his name. A few people do. Have you ever remember those World War I posters? I want you, Uncle Sam.
Yes, I do know that.
Okay. Well, he not only met Uncle Sam, he met the artist who painted that picture.
Wow.
His name was James Montgomery Flagg, which is great, and he who drew some caricatures of Chesterton.
Cool.
Yeah.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
Do we have those?
Yeah.
Cool. We should show them.
Yeah, we should.
Well, we'll try to get our hands on that, but no promises.
No promises. We'll dig them up eventually. We have them somewhere.
Okay, cool. So was his experience good? Did he like it here?
He did. He found America a warm and welcoming place. Loved the people very much. There's a very famous story of when he arrived in New York and he was taken to see the great sights of New York City. And when he was shown the lights of Broadway, he said, "Well, it would be very beautiful if only one didn't read."
If one didn't read,
yes.
What do you mean by that?
Because all the lights
right,
New York,
okay.
On Broadway were marquee signs,
Gotcha.
Advertising things, and
that's funny.
He said the lights were beautiful if only one didn't have to read them.
Okay.
Yes.
Nice. Well, let's talk about the main thing we want to address. What did he speak about here?
Yeah, I think it's interesting what he chose to speak about, and and to look back on it, and what do you say? It still rings true. I was looking back at some of the accounts of the talks. You have to understand, every place he went, it was front page news. He was just hugely welcome. He had a great reputation coming in. He was a worldwide celebrity, and it's something to think about, writers being celebrities back then. But
I know.
This is
just back when people read.
Yeah, people read, exactly. And he he had three main talks he would kind of recycle as he spoke throughout the country. But three things struck me. One was he noticed that we have an obsession with health that has made us miserable.
Whoa. Whoa.
And he also noticed that we have a government that doesn't represent us. And he noticed that our journalists don't tell the truth.
Wow. Okay. That's crazy.
It is crazy. Amazingly prophetic. Of course, he spoke as a journalist. He goes, I'm a journalist myself. I know what it's like to write nonsense. But he saw that our journalists almost deliberately tell the lie, and possibly without the almost.
So not much has changed, it sounds like, in the last 100 years.
Yeah, that's why those 100 years probably went by so fast, because and that's why, you read Chesterton now, he seems to be talking to us right now. But those general themes came across. But let me go into a little more specific. Mm-hmm. So one of the names of the talks that he recycled was The Perils of Health.
Okay.
And also timely is that he came to America and found that all the bars were closed, and that all the people were very unhappy about the bars being closed, but they all felt very helpless to do anything about it because it was a nationwide law that had closed the bars, and the rationale behind the law was that it was being done for health reasons. Now, of course, the name of that law was prohibition. Mm-hmm. And he said that during his entire time in America, he never met one person who supported prohibition, and yet it was the law of the land. Mm-hmm. But he says the problem with the perils of health is that this obsession with health on the part of Americans has become morbid, and it's connected to health fads and fashions. And he quoted a very comic song from England, from musical theater in England. Father's got the sack from the waterworks for smoking of his old cherry briar. Father's got the sack from the waterworks 'cause he might set the waterworks on fire. And, that's kind of typical of the absurdity of these sweeping health and safety regulations that just have lost all touch with common sense.
Right. I think we talked about this earlier, but it's funny that 100 years ago, liquor was illegal. And now 100 years later, liquor is an essential because they had to have stayed open for during the lockdown.
Right. But the way they treated liquor then, they're treating smoking now.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. And there was no prohibition on smoking then, but he warned there would be. He says if they can prohibit liquor, they'll prohibit smoking. Well,
yep, there. Wow.
So that is probably the talk that he gave the most. Was under the title of "The Ignorance of the Educated," mm-hmm. And he started that talk. And every time he gave the talk, it was going to be a little bit different every time because it was always extemporaneous. But he would always quote a very famous American humorist named Artemus Ward, who said, "It ain't so much men's ignorance that does the harm as their knowing so many things that ain't so."
Okay, whoa.
And that you can see why Chester was charmed by that. It's funny because all the press reported him quoting Artemus Ward. Someone else later pointed out that it wasn't Artemus Ward that said it, it was Josh Billings, another American humorist, and Chesterton later corrected it. But, in other words, nobody knew it at the time that he was misquoting the right quote but the wrong author. And, of course, he was... there was the great irony and paradox that the press was very amused by the fact that here he is filling up all these lecture halls and theaters by telling people that all the stuff they know isn't true.
Yeah. Going back to the idea of Americans being obsessed with health, it was really funny. I walked out of a lecture one time when I was in college, and I remember overhearing a conversation between two students, and one of the girls, I just heard her say, "No, I'm serious. Health is happiness. Health is happiness." And it was so funny because she didn't seem very happy when she was having this conversation. But I just remember that very vividly.
Oh, that's very... Chester would have a field day with that.
Yeah,
line.
I know.
Very fun.
Because
Very
Chesterton, who may have not been the healthiest and not by his own fault, he just wasn't, graced naturally with health. He obviously was very happy. That's why we always want to imitate his joy and everything.
Yep.
And there you go.
Yeah, he was plagued with one problem after another, and his wife too.
Yeah.
The two of them.
I didn't know about his wife.
Yeah. She probably suffered much worse than he did, and the two of them very happy. Yeah. So that one of the people that he cited in his lectures was his great friend H.G. Wells, who had just published a book, The Outline of History, which is a very famous book. Wells made his name as a novelist. He gave us War of the Worlds and The Invisible Man and The Time Machine. Those, kind of the great science fiction writer.
Mm-hmm.
And then he wrote a book of the history of the world, and it really amounted to more science fiction in Chesterton's eyes, because he would tell these romantic narratives of how the caveman would hit the cave woman over the head and drag her away by her hair. Things that we would see cartoons about when we were growing up. But Wells wrote about it as if it was serious, as if that's what really happened. And of course, there's no evidence for that at all. Zero. And Chesterton says, if primitive men were so rude, why were primitive women so refined? And he says, the problem with prehistory is that there's no record of it, so we don't really know anything about it.
Yeah, we just assume that they're more like apes than men.
Yeah, we do. And of course, during this time, there was the great obsession with the missing link, which, technically doesn't exist because it's missing.
Right, exactly, yeah.
And yet they're always telling us about the characteristics of the missing link.
All we know is that when they started doing cave paintings and making tools, all we know is that there was an element of elegance and refinement, because that's what we see the evidence of, right?
Yeah, and of course that's the exact point that Chesterton makes in The Everlasting Man, which is the book he
probably
wrote.
Said it better.
Well, yeah, he wrote it, that book, just 3 or 4 years after his visit to America, which is really the full length rebuttal to Wells' outline of history. And he said, the one thing we know about the caveman for sure is that he's an artist, because we still have the art. Yeah.
Exactly, yeah.
Yeah, and that's something that only humans do. Animals don't do that.
By the way, I remember reading an article about the one thing we know is that they made tools. And I remember thinking about the difference that Chesterton points out, that he was an artist, but that there's a lot of essays talking about how what marks the beginning of man is tools. And I was wondering what the relationship between the two ideas is. And the Greek word for art, remember, is techne, and they didn't really distinguish between the art for beauty's sake and the art for utility. So it actually might be the same idea, the same thing. It was the same exact development. Now in modern day, we like to divorce the idea of beauty and utility. Yeah, but they didn't. So that makes sense why we're actually talking about the same thing.
Same thing. Yeah, that does make sense. That does.
Anyway, sorry. What were
No, that's okay. I was going to say, so his other disagreements with Wells. I mean, the other main point, he's kind of holding these debates with Wells, who isn't there.
Mm-hmm.
But ironically, Wells was supposed to come to America just a few months before that, and was ill and never did his lecture tour. So
wow.
he was probably anticipating Wells having been there, but he didn't come. But he really went after Wells' notion of progress. Because Wells was this whole argument is that we were primitive, we were rough, and now we're civilized. Well, Chesterton's arguing, that maybe our present civilization isn't better than some former civilizations that we had. That this progress hasn't really been measurable the way that they are claiming. In many ways, there's some things about the past that are superior to the way things are in the present. And yet they're always talking about where this next step is going to be, which we're going to get into in a minute. But he says that Wells talks about a world state. And Chesterton says, I have great doubt about the value of a world state. A world state would quite likely be the worst governed the mind of man can conceive. Why, it's hard enough to get representatives to represent when they are right here and we can see and control them. How can we control them if they are far off? Now, what does that remind you of?
That reminds me of globalism.
Yes, and the contrary?
Localism. There we go.
So he was
By the
talking...
way, this is actually a good opportunity to talk about the reaction that we've gotten from announcing the name shift from distributism to localism. If you haven't been following that, we have gotten a lot of good comments. I mean, even if some people are kind of hesitant about it or don't like the name, we've had a very constructive conversation in the YouTube comments of that episode. It's a new name for distributism. That's what that episode is called, and it's a really good conversation. I mean, they listened to us when we said, okay, if you don't like it, announce a new name for it. So suggest a different name other than distributism, because we kind of agree that doesn't work. So to their credit, they did. They announced other names, and I don't know if we completely agree with them being a good alternative, but that was really nice to see. Anyway, that's what I wanted to.
Yeah, it shows people are thinking about the concept, but I think it in many ways it did affirm that localism not only reflects Chesterton's thinking very well, but it's something everybody can connect to right away.
Yeah, and in fact, Bishop Barron announced, he put it in one of his articles, he mentioned you and said that a new name for distributism could be localism.
Yeah.
I still can't say that word, distributism.
Well, that's another problem. Can't say it.
Yeah. But I'll put the article in the description so that you guys can look at it. It's pretty cool that he did that. Anyway, yeah.
So that was great how Chesterton saw that the world was going towards even a more global government and economy then. Mm-hmm. And of course, it's worse now than it was then. But he says, I don't think it's going to be a good thing when it happens.
Well, that's very interesting because he's talking to the right crowd. I mean, America was too far away from Britain,
right?
And so they separated, right? They localized, which makes sense. So did people react well to that message?
I think everyone was amused and provoked by everything Chesterton said. Okay. You know, they always left scratching their head, and some people resonated with them right away, and the press, you could see some articles having just a straightforward report, but some are kind of wryly remarking about this giant walking paradox, G.K. Chesterton.
Yeah.
He had another funny line that he repeated in many of the lectures about if Patrick Henry, the great American patriot, who was arguing, of course, for the separation from England in the time of the American Revolution, he stood up and said, "Give me liberty or give me death." That's his famous line. In fact,
I forgot that.
Most people don't know anything about Patrick Henry except that he said that, right? So he said if Patrick Henry were to return to life now, and he was looking at the civilized world and its present state, he might simplify his line to "give me death."
Yeah, that's funny.
And his other, as far as the ignorance of the educated, he's talking about, it's the educated, it's what's being taught in our schools that is promoting ignorance. That's what he's saying back in 1921. And it's the people who are educated really don't have a good grasp of what is real and what is true. And what's happened, of course, is that they've rejected just a straightforward common sense in favor of what he says, a long-winded pseudoscientific evasion. Good line.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Wow.
And then, of course, this is another amazing prophetic thing. He said he was really distressed by the people who spoke with such great authority without knowing what they were talking about. And he said one of the prime examples of this was the discussion, both scientific and political, about races.
Wow, really?
Yes.
Back then.
Now, back then, it wasn't so much black and white that he would talk about that, too. He said, he was amazed by the problem of racial hatred in America. He said, it's something he noticed right away. I remember we
talked about that during the George Floyd
riots. Right. But there was all these racial theories that were being promoted at the time in Europe. And, of course, one of them is what led to Nazism.
Wow.
He was, warning against that 20 years before the rise of Hitler.
And everyone points to America as, being such a history of racism. I mean, this was happening at the same time. Worse, I would say worse in Britain.
Much worse. And they're making distinctions on people who are all kind of whitely colored, right?
Yeah,
but they're saying this race is superior to that race, and in fact, so much so that we're going to take that one out.
Dang, yeah.
That's amazing.
Wow. Well, what is there anything else that you wanted to mention about his trip?
Real quickly, he also talked about the other talk was called the "Shall We Abolish the Inevitable?"
Okay, right. Yeah.
So the ignorance of the educated was about those who prognosticated about the past, if it were, and the inevitable ones were those who were telling the history of the future. Right? And they're both talking about things that they really don't know what they're talking about. And
I have to say, I mean, with from a scientific standpoint, it's true that the scientific community is credible on a lot of things. Yeah. But the one thing that they haven't had a great record with is predicting the future.
Yes.
On a lot of things. I mean, we can predict pretty well if a car, is hurtling down a cliff or a hill or whatever. We can pretty well predict where it's going to land, right? But then we try to predict the weather, which, is closer than the stars, like as Chesterton says. This is definitely taken from Chesterton. And we can't do it very well. In fact, really badly. Yeah, so when I think a lot of times people say, well, you're not, the scientific community, there's a scientific consensus on this and stuff. Well, if it has to do with the future, I think we should be a little bit skeptical, or we should just investigate a little more. And that's actually something Elon Musk said. I think he's pretty credible. He's actually, right now, I think he's richer than Jeff Bezos. Do you know that?
Well, if that's a gauge of someone,
no, I didn't mean that as a gauge. I just thought that was an interesting thing. Yeah. But he was talking to a reporter, and she was trying to throw people like certain skeptics under the bus, and there are people who don't know what they're talking about. But she was talking to Elon Musk and saying, what do you think about these skeptics and stuff? And he started by saying, well, I think a certain amount of skepticism is healthy in science, which totally makes sense. Right. Because every time when we come up with a new theory, it's going to contradict. A lot of times it contradicts older theories.
It's going to be replacing a theory usually.
In fact, yeah, exactly. Yeah. Quantum. Once we came up with quantum theory, that contradicted what we had in place for Newtonian science, for Newtonian physics. Yeah. So that's the idea, that we come up with a new theory that contradicts something else, or just completely trusting what is in place for science right now, is not a bad thing. Sorry, that was a little rant.
No, it's fantastic, but it fits in with what Chesterton talks about. Americans, they fall for a new fad right away.
Exactly.
They don't have that healthy skepticism when something new comes along.
Yeah.
And the predictions about the future are something people follow right away. But his main argument against it was it's always an attack on free will, because the inevitable is always about the doom, fatalism, and this is what's going to happen.
Yeah, and that's why actually, yes, a lot of scientific models about the future, predicting the future, have been wrong. And other scientists have said this. It's because they forget to account for human will, for human act. What are humans going to do? They're bad at that.
Thing that if we could predict how humans are going to behave, which we, Chester says the expert can be right 9 times out of 10, but the 10th time comes, and that's the problem.
Yep, exactly.
At some point, humans will either surprise you or disappoint you. They'll do something that no one predicted.
Which is why a lot of economic models are not good. I mean, you can categorize that as a science, sure, but it's not very accurate.
And speaking of economics, Chesterton said in one of his talks, he said the two people who did more harm than anyone, he said, were John Calvin and Karl Marx. Wow. And they're both fatalists. They're both determinists. That's what Calvin gave us, which broke up Christendom with his
shortly after Luther.
Yeah, right. But it was the attack on free will and predestination. And then Karl Marx basically puts predestination into his study of history and economics. This is what's going to happen. And he says that's the untold damage that those two thinkers
which is interesting, because a lot of times people who are viewed as skeptical about a certain scientific theory are viewed as a religious nut, but we're actually saying it's partly the Calvinist philosophy, which is a religious thing, that is responsible for certain scientific
Yes.
fallacies.
Yeah, and that's
Yeah.
Chesterton makes exactly that point.
Yeah.
That kind of thinking has crossed over into science, into economics, into psychology.
Yeah.
This attack on free will, that it's all somehow programmed into your genes, into space, into the atoms, and there's no choice involved. Yeah.
Yeah. Cool.
So that's what it was. It was a great trip, and he came back 10 years later, and maybe 10 years from now we'll talk about that trip.
All right. Sounds good. All right. And you mentioned education briefly. Well, I just wanted to tell our folks that the Chesterton Schools Network hit the year off well. And I if anyone's interested about sending your kid to a Chesterton Academy or starting another Chesterton Academy, make sure to contact us. I'll put the link in the description. You go to chestertonschoolsnetwork.org. And yeah, I think that's about it, right?
We are definitely battling the ignorance of the educated. That's what we're doing.
All right. Well, thank you everyone for listening or watching. Until next time, help us to make uncommon sense more common.